I was born in the spring of 1842 in Zanesville, Ohio. My father was a dry goods merchant, a careful man of moderate means and considerable principle, who had opinions about most things and expressed them without apology. We were a family of 4 children. My brother George was 3 years my senior, and I had 2 younger sisters, Anne and Louise. My mother died when Louise was barely 2 years old, which put a great deal of the household management on my shoulders from an early age. I was 11 when she went. I learned to cook and to keep accounts and to negotiate with suppliers before I was 14. And I believe this education served me better in the years that followed than anything the schoolhouse had to offer, though I valued that too. My father was not a man who grieved openly, but he was a man who noticed, and he saw that I had taken on the weight of the house without complaint, and he repaid that noticing by treating me from a fairly young age as someone whose judgment was worth consulting. This too served me. George enlisted in the Union Army in the autumn of 1861, when he was 22 and I was 19. He was gone until 1865, and he came back thin and with a persistent cough that never entirely left him, but he came back, which is more than could be said for many families I knew in those years. The war was a presence in our house even when it was happening somewhere else entirely, in the prices at the shop, in the letters that came irregularly and said less than they should, in my father's face on the evenings when the newspapers were bad. I thought about the war a great deal in the years that followed, though not in the way one might expect. I came to think about the men who did not fight in it, who left it, or evaded it, or simply ceased to be the men who had entered it, and what that cost them, and what it cost the people who loved them without knowing what they had done or left undone. I did not go west immediately. I stayed in Zanesville until I was 23, keeping my father's house and his accounts, watching the men who had survived the war come home and take up the business of ordinary life with varying degrees of success. Some of them managed it well, others did not. The war had reached inside certain men and rearranged what it found there, and no amount of peacetime living put those things back into their original order. I was aware of this in the way that a young woman who has managed a household from the age of 11 becomes aware of most practical realities earlier than is perhaps comfortable. I met the man I knew as Caleb Voss in the spring of 1865, in the last weeks of the war, when he came through Zanesville on his way east from Pittsburgh, where he had been working in the iron trade for the better part of 2 years. He was 29 years old, lean and dark-haired, with careful gray eyes and a quality of deliberateness about him. Everything he did with a kind of attention that suggested he had learned not to waste motion. He was from Pennsylvania, he said. He had lost his parents young and had no family of any account remaining back east, and he had a mind to go west as soon as the country settled itself sufficiently. He had money enough for a start, he said, and the inclination to put it toward land somewhere. A man could build something worth building. He was in Zanesville for 2 weeks. He came to my father's shop 4 times on various pretexts. On the 3rd visit, my father invited him to supper. On the 4th visit, Caleb asked my father's permission to call on me formally. My father gave it. By the time Caleb departed Zanesville in June of '65, we had an understanding between us, though not yet a formal engagement. He wrote to me from Pittsburgh, and then from Cincinnati, and then from St. Louis, and then, in the early months of 1866, from Denver City in Colorado Territory, where he had arrived with the intention of buying into a mining operation near a settlement called Central City, 30-some miles into the mountains to the west. The letters were good letters, detailed, observant, careful in the way that he was careful about everything. He described the mountains with a precision that made me see them, the way the snow on the peaks held its light long after the valleys had gone dark, the particular quality of the air at altitude that made everything feel slightly more immediate than it did at lower ground. He wrote about the men he was working with, about the character of the mining camps, about the land available for homesteading in the valleys below the mining operations. He said he believed there was a future to be made there. He asked me to come and make it with him. I went. My father thought I was going too far and said so once, and then did not say so again, which was his way of accepting a decision he could not alter. George thought I was brave, which at the time I believed was an accurate assessment, and which I have since come to think was simply another word for young. I traveled by rail to the end of the line, and then by stage to Denver City, and Caleb met me at the stage office, and we were married 3 days later by a Methodist circuit minister who had been in Colorado Territory for 6 years, and had, by his own account, married more couples in mining camps than he had in formal churches, and thought this was probably appropriate given the circumstances of the frontier. We settled on 160 acres in the valley east of Central City, which Caleb had filed on under the Homestead Act 2 years before I arrived. The land was good, a creek running through the lower quarter, enough level ground to farm on, and the mountains behind providing timber when timber was needed. Caleb worked his share in the Gregory mine above town, which was a silver operation by then, most of the surface gold having been worked out in the early years of the rush. He was a steady worker and a capable one, and the men he worked with respected him, and the life we built together in that valley was a hard one in the way that all frontier lives are hard, but it was also, for most of those 12 years, a good one. We had 3 children. James came first in October of 67, and then Ruth in the spring of 69, and then Clara in the winter of 72. All 3 lived, which I have always been grateful for, knowing well enough how many families on the frontier could not say the same. The children grew up between the mountains and the valley, knowing both the particular rhythms of a working mine and the particular rhythms of a homestead farm, and they were capable children, curious, and not given to complaint, which I believe came from their father more than from me, though I've always taken some credit for it. There are things I could tell you about those 12 years that would sound like happiness, and they would be true. I am not revising the happiness out of the account in light of what I learned afterward. The happiness was real. I will say it plainly. I loved the man I knew as Caleb Voss. I loved him in the way that a practical woman loves a practical man, not with the kind of feeling that consumes good sense, but with a steady and daily affection grounded in the knowledge of what a person does when things are difficult, how he speaks to the children when he is exhausted, whether he keeps his word when keeping it costs him something. On all of those measures, the man I knew as Caleb Voss was worth loving. He was patient with James when James was young and willful. He was gentle with Ruth when she was ill with the fever in the winter of '73, and we did not know for several days which way it would go. He built the second room on the homestead the summer before Claire was born, without being asked, because he had calculated that we would need it and did not wait to be told. These things are not nothing. These things are, in fact, most of what a marriage is. What I did not know was the weight he carried alongside the life he had built with me, what he had left behind, and what he had taken that was not his to take, and how he had managed to be, for 12 years, both the man I knew and the man I never knew at all. I have wondered, in the years since, whether there were signs I missed. Small things, a particular stillness that came over him on certain evenings, a reluctance to speak of his family or his boyhood, the locked trunk that moved with us through 3 different arrangements of the homestead and was always in a place he could see from wherever he spent his evenings. I noticed these things at the time in the way that one notices ordinary details of a shared life without assigning them significance. A man may have reasons for his silences that have nothing to do with deception. I had enough of my own. I did not press him. Caleb died in September of 1878. There was a collapse in the lower gallery of the Gregory mine. A section of timbering gave way, they said, in the way that timbering in worked out sections sometimes does when the surrounding rock shifts in the autumn after a dry summer. The men who were in that section did not come out. Caleb was among them. He was 42 years old. I will not dwell long on the days that followed. Death on the frontier comes in its own time and with its own particular weight, and the frontier does not pause for a widow's grief except to the extent that the widow pauses for it herself. There were children to feed and a homestead to manage, and a season's work half finished in the fields, and I managed these things in the way that women on the frontier have always managed them, one day at a time, each morning an act of will that after enough repetition ceases to feel like will and begins to feel simply like living. My neighbors were decent people and they helped where they could. By November, I had begun to take stock of what was before me, and by winter, I had a provisional understanding with James Henderson, who farmed the next parcel east, to share the heavier labor through the following year in exchange for a portion of my summer harvest. It was a practical arrangement of the sort that the frontier requires, and James Henderson was a practical and honorable man. It was in October, a month after Caleb's death, that I found the trunk. I'd been going through Caleb's belongings in the methodical way that widowhood requires, deciding what could be kept and what could be sold and what could be given to the children as they grew older. The trunk was a large one, old, with brass fittings and a lock for which Caleb had always kept the key on his person. I had noted this over the years. The key was on his person, always, not on the hook by the door where most keys lived. I thought nothing of it at the time. A man is entitled to his private papers. There was nothing unusual in the keeping of a locked trunk. I had the trunk broken open by the blacksmith in Central City. I told him it had been locked when Caleb bought it second-hand, and I had never found the key. The blacksmith asked no questions. The trunk contained on its upper layer what one would expect: letters I had written to Caleb before our marriage, documents pertaining to the land claim, a small amount of coin, the children's birth records in Caleb's careful hand. These I removed and set aside. Below them, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with cord, were the things I had not expected. There were letters written in German, 4 of them, addressed to someone named August, in a hand I did not recognize. My German was adequate, learned in childhood from a neighbor woman who had come from Bavaria, and who believed that the more languages a girl knew, the better equipped she was for whatever the world put before her. The letters were from a mother. They asked where August was, why he had not written, what had happened to him after the regiment was disbanded. They mentioned other family members by name, a father, 2 sisters, a farm in Roanoke County in Virginia.
Before we continue, a quick word. I've released 14 full recordings that will never be on YouTube. These are the voices too personal, too raw to share publicly, completely unedited, nothing cut. If you want access, the link is in the description. It's called The Lost Recordings, and getting it helps us keep making these videos. Alright, back to the story.
The most recent was dated 1863, posted from Virginia, and it had been opened and read. It had never been answered. There was a Confederate Army muster roll, partially charred at one edge, listing the men of a Virginia infantry company mustered in the spring of 1861. Third from the bottom, in the column of names, Dietrich, August Wilhelm. Beside it, in a different hand than the original, a notation, deserted, July 1862. There was a newspaper clipping from a Harrisburg, Pennsylvania paper dated May of 1862. The headline read, "Local Man Among Dead at Shiloh." Below it, a brief notice, Private Caleb James Voss, son of the late Jonas Voss of Harrisburg, is reported among the casualties of the Battle of Shiloh, fought April 6th and 7th last. Private Voss is survived by his brother, Martin Voss, of this city. Private Voss was 25 years of age, and there was one final document. It was a letter, written in a hand I recognized as Caleb's, the hand I had been reading for 12 years, the hand that had described the mountains and the snow and the light above Central City, the hand that had written our children's names in the family Bible. It was addressed to no one. It may have been intended for me, or it may have been intended only for himself, a private reckoning he had been unable to bring to completion. It was 4 paragraphs long. I've read it perhaps 200 times in the 37 years since I found it, and I know it as well as I know any passage of Scripture. He wrote that his name was August Wilhelm Dietrich, born in Roanoke County, Virginia, in the year 1836, that he had enlisted in the Confederate Army in the spring of '61 and had found, by the summer of '62, that he could not continue in what he had enlisted to do. Not from cowardice, he wrote, or at least not only from cowardice, but from a settled conviction that the cause he had enlisted in was wrong, and that the men he would be called upon to face across a field of battle were not, in any meaningful sense, his enemies. He had deserted in July of 1862, made his way west with considerable difficulty, and arrived in Colorado Territory in the autumn of that year with nothing except the clothes he stood in and a name he had taken from a newspaper notice found in a Denver city saloon, the notice of a young Pennsylvania man killed at Shiloh, a man without surviving parents, a man whose name would not be missed by anyone in a position to look for it in the territory records. He wrote that he had intended, when he first took the name, to use it only temporarily, only until he had established himself sufficiently to reclaim his own identity without danger of arrest for desertion, that the temporary use had become permanent as the years accumulated, and the life built under the borrowed name became more real to him than anything the original name had meant. He wrote that he had found in building that life something he had not expected to find, that the man he had been when he was August Dietrich was someone he did not wish to be, and that the man he became as Caleb Voss was someone he was not ashamed of, and that this did not make what he had done right, but was simply the true accounting of how it felt to have done it. In the last paragraph he wrote about me. He wrote that he had not told me because he was afraid, not of what I would do. He said he believed I would have kept his secret, that I was a woman of sufficient practical intelligence to understand what exposure would mean for the children and the land, but of what I would think of him, that he could bear my knowing the fact of what he had done more easily than he could bear my knowing the fullness of what he had been before he did it. He asked in the final sentences that I forgive him. He did not say for what precisely. He may have meant the desertion. He may have meant the stolen name. He may have meant the 12 years of living beside me as a man I had never actually met. I put the letter down and sat very still for what I believe was a considerable time. The candle burned low, and I did not move to replace it. The children were asleep. The house was entirely quiet except for the creek beyond the lower field, which runs through all seasons and keeps its own counsel, regardless of what transpires in the house above it. I have thought about what I felt in that particular hour many times in the years since, trying to name it accurately, because I believe in accurate naming and because inaccuracy in this accounting would be a further wrong added to a sufficient inventory of them already. What I felt was not, in the first instance, anger. Anger came later, and it was not inconsiderable when it arrived. What I felt in that first hour was something closer to the specific vertigo of a person who has been standing on ground she believed to be solid and has discovered, without warning, that what she took for stone is something altogether different beneath the surface. Not that the ground had given way, that it had never been what she thought it was. The distinction matters. One is an event. The other is a revision of everything that came before it. I sat with those documents for 3 days before I decided what to do with them. I want to be honest about those 3 days, because the honesty is the only thing I have left to offer at this stage of my life. I did not, in those 3 days, consider for very long the question of what was right. I considered it because I am not a woman who avoids such questions, but I did not consider it for long because the right answer was clear enough, and I knew I was not going to take it. The right answer was to contact Martin Voss in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and to tell him that his brother Caleb was not buried in the churchyard at Shiloh, as the record said, but in the ground of Central City, Colorado, under a name not his own, beside a woman he had never honestly introduced himself to. To return the name to the man it belonged to, so that Martin Voss could have the thing that families who lose men to war most need and are most often denied, a grave they can stand beside, a place that acknowledges the existence of what was lost. During those 3 days, I sat with the documents spread on the kitchen table after the children were in bed, and I did the accounting that a woman, who has kept a merchant's book since childhood is equipped to do, I went through every consequence I could foresee. If I disclosed the truth, the Homestead Act claim filed in the name of Caleb James Voss would be called into question. I did not know precisely what the territorial law would make of a claim filed under an assumed identity, whether it would be considered fraud sufficient to void the filing, or whether my years of residence and improvement would be considered separately from the fraudulent original claim. I did not have a lawyer to ask, and the nearest man with any legal knowledge was in Denver City, 3 hours down the mountain by stage. What I did know was that uncertainty of that kind, in that country and in those years, was itself a form of ruin. To invite inquiry was to invite the possibility of losing the land regardless of how the law ultimately ruled, because the process of inquiry would cost money and time and community standing that a widow on the frontier could not afford to spend. I also went through what disclosure would mean for the children's names. James Voss, age 11, had that name in every record the territory had made of him: his school records, his baptism record at the Central City Methodist congregation, the land improvement records that would eventually support the inheritance of the homestead. To reveal that his father had been August Dietrich of Virginia was to reveal that James's surname was not his by any legitimate chain of descent, that it had been borrowed from a dead man in a Pennsylvania newspaper and used to build a life on land that could not have been claimed under the true name, because August Dietrich, Confederate deserter, could not have filed a Homestead Act claim in the Colorado Territory in the year of our Lord, 1864, without considerable risk of arrest and prosecution. The name Voss was not merely a name to my children, it was the architecture of their legal existence in that territory. These were the 3 days' work. Not a moral argument precisely, more a thorough accounting of costs and distributions, of who would pay what and for how long. I was 36 years old. My husband was 6 weeks in the ground. My youngest was 6. By the end of the 3rd day, I had an answer that was not right and was not comfortable and was the only one I was going to take. What I chose instead was the land, the homestead, the 160 acres with the creek running through the lower quarter that my children had grown up on, and that depended, for its legal standing, on the Homestead Act claim filed in the name of Caleb James Voss. I chose James, who was 11 years old and whose entire understanding of himself was rooted in a name that was not his grandfather's name and not his father's name and not, in any bloodline sense, any name that belonged to him at all. I chose Ruth, who was 9, and Clara, who was 6. I chose the life that had been built on a foundation I had not chosen and could not now, having discovered what it was made of, pretend I did not know. I put the German letters and the muster roll and the newspaper clipping and the letter in the back of the fireplace one evening in late October of 1878, when all 3 children were asleep, and I burned them until there was nothing left but ash and the smell of old paper, which cleared by morning. Then I went to bed, and I did not sleep for a very long time. What I could not burn was what I knew. A widow can destroy documents. She cannot destroy the knowledge that the documents contained, and cannot prevent that knowledge from becoming a permanent resident of whatever interior country she inhabits for the rest of her life. August Dietrich came to live in me the night I burned his letters, and he has been living there ever since, alongside the man I called Caleb and the husband I believed I had, and the three of them together are a considerable crowd for one woman to carry. For 4 years and 9 months, nothing happened. I worked the homestead, raised the children, made the practical arrangements that a widow on the frontier must make, and I did not think about Martin Voss in Harrisburg, except occasionally, in the small hours. In the way one thinks about something one has decided not to think about, which is to say frequently and without resolution. The years had a quality to them during that time that I can only describe as deliberate. I was deliberate in everything I did, in a way that went beyond ordinary industry. I planted the kitchen garden each spring with the particular attention of a woman who has proven something to herself. I made the mortgage payments on schedule. I maintained the fencing along the creek without waiting for it to fail. I was building, I understood even at the time, a case for the decision I had made, a proof laid down in seasons of work that the land had been worth what I had chosen to protect it. Whether that case was persuasive, I have never been entirely certain. It was the case I had. He arrived in June of 1883. He was a large man, perhaps 50 years of age, with the look of a man who has worked with his hands for most of his life and has not found the work disagreeable. He wore a good wool coat that was slightly too warm for the Colorado summer, and he held his hat in both hands when I opened the door. And he had the expression of a man who has come a very long way on the strength of a possibility he is not certain will prove out. He introduced himself as Martin Voss of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. He said he was looking for any information about his brother Caleb, who had served with the 78th Pennsylvania Infantry, and whose death at Shiloh in April of '62 had never been confirmed to his satisfaction by a grave or by any physical evidence. He had spent years writing letters to pension offices and Army records bureaus and had found, in the records of the Colorado Territory Land Office, a Homestead Act claim filed in '64 under the name Caleb James Voss, which was his brother's full name, a name that was not common. He had written to the land office and been told the claim was held by the widow of one Caleb Voss, deceased. He asked if he might speak with me. I stood in the doorway of the house that Caleb, that August, had built with his own hands on land claimed in a dead man's name, and I looked at Martin Voss from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, who had come 2,000 miles to find some small piece of his brother, and I made the choice that I have made every day since, in the sense that I have not reversed it, and have not found sufficient reason to reverse it, though I have looked for such reasons more diligently than I have looked for anything else in my life. I told him that my husband had been named Caleb Voss, yes, but that it was not an uncommon name. There had been, I believed, several Voss families in Pennsylvania, and mine had been from the western part of the state, from a line that had no connection to Harrisburg that I was aware of. I told him my husband had died in a mine collapse in '78 and was buried in the Central City churchyard, and that the grave marker said Caleb James Voss, and that beyond the name I could offer him nothing that would help him find his brother, because the man buried in Central City was not, so far as I knew, the man he was looking for. Martin Voss stood on my porch for a long moment. He looked past me into the house, not impolitely, but the way a man looks into a house when he is trying to find something in it that will tell him whether he has come to the right place. He looked at my children, who were old enough by then to stand in the doorway and observe a stranger with the frank curiosity of frontier children. James was 15 that June, tall already, with his father's careful gray eyes, and I was aware of the eyes in a way I had not been before Martin Voss arrived, aware of what a man looking for his brother might see in them. I kept my own expression steady and said nothing further. I do not know what Martin Voss saw in that doorway. I have wondered about it for 32 years. He was a man who had spent years looking, writing to pension offices, tracing land records, coming 2,000 miles on the strength of a name that was not common, and such men develop, I imagine, a particular attention to detail that ordinary searching does not require. Whether he saw something in the house, in my face, in the gray eyes of my 15-year-old son that gave him a reason to doubt my account, I cannot say. He gave no indication of it. His expression did not change in any way I could read with certainty. He simply stood and looked for that long moment, and then he thanked me in the quiet way of a man who has practiced courtesy in the face of disappointment, and something in that courtesy cost me more than hostility would have. He put his hat back on his head. He walked back to his horse, which was tied to the fence post at the edge of the yard, and he mounted and rode east down the valley road, and I watched him until the road turned and the cottonwood trees along the creek took him out of sight. I have not seen Martin Voss again from that day to this. I've thought about what he did after he left my porch. I believe he went back to Harrisburg and lived out the rest of his life not knowing what had happened to his brother. I believe he died, as most people do, still carrying the particular incompleteness of a loss that was never confirmed and therefore never entirely real. The loss that lives in the space between what you fear and what you know, which is a harder space to inhabit than either certainty would have been. I made that space for him. I chose it deliberately, with full knowledge of what I was choosing, and I have not been able to find, in 32 years of turning the question over, a calculus that makes my choice entirely defensible or entirely indefensible. It is simply what I did. It is the thing I will answer for when I answer for things. My children do not know. I've carried this without putting any part of it down, in the way that a woman who has spent her life managing difficult realities learns to carry what cannot be set aside. James farms the land his father claimed under a name not his father's own. Ruth lives in Pueblo with a man who believes her maiden name to be Voss, because that is what it says on her birth record, which Caleb, which August, wrote in his careful hand in the family Bible. Clara is in Denver, and she has 3 children of her own who call me grandmother, without any knowledge of the particular architecture of the name they have inherited. I married again in '87, a decent man named Robert Alderman who asked few questions about the past and had his own reasons for preferring a life that looked forward rather than backward. We had 21 years together, and they were good years, and he died in 1908, and I have been a widow again since then. Robert did not know about the trunk or the letters, or Martin Voss on the porch in '83. There was no reason to burden him with it. I kept that interior country to myself, as I had learned to do. There is, perhaps, a certain irony in the fact that I kept another secret from another husband, that I became, through my own choosing, a version of the thing that had been done to me. I am aware of this irony. I don't find it particularly amusing, but I don't deny it. The years with Robert were genuinely good ones. I want to say this plainly because the account I am giving might suggest that my life after Caleb's death was entirely defined by what I knew and could not say, and this would not be accurate. Robert Alderman was a companionable man, steady in the way that the best frontier men are steady, not dramatic, not given to declarations, but present and consistent in all the ways that presence and consistency matter over the long run of a shared life. He built a good barn the second year we were married and was proud of it, and the pride was warranted. He liked the children, and the children liked him, which was not a foregone conclusion. We were comfortable together, and comfort, after the years I had navigated alone, was not a small thing. I was grateful for it every day he was living, and I have missed it every day since he went. I'm 73 years old. My health is tolerably good for a woman of my age who has spent her life at altitude, though my hands have stiffened considerably in the last few years, and the cold finds me in the winters in a way it did not before. I do not expect a great many more winters. This is not self-pity. It is simply arithmetic. The same arithmetic I have been doing since my father taught me to keep accounts at the age of 12. There are things I have made my peace with, and there are things I have not, and I will not pretend otherwise for the comfort of anyone listening. I have made my peace with the man who called himself Caleb Voss and the life he built alongside me on that Colorado homestead. I have come to believe, over 37 years of reflection, that August Dietrich left Virginia because he did not wish to kill men he had no quarrel with, and that this impulse, cowardly in its execution perhaps, but not entirely dishonorable in its source, was not the worst foundation a man could build a life upon. I've come to believe that the husband I had was, in the daily and practical sense, a good man, even if the name he answered to was a kind of theft. These are the conclusions I have arrived at, and they are not comfortable conclusions, but they are honest ones. What I have not made my peace with is Martin Voss. I have thought about the moment on the porch 10,000 times since it happened, and in none of those 10,000 revisitations have I arrived at the version where I tell him the truth. I would choose the same way every time. I know this about myself. I chose the children and the land and the name, and I would choose them again, and this consistency does not comfort me the way I perhaps imagined it might. There's a difference between a decision that is right and a decision you would make again, and I have spent 32 years living in the space between those two things. What I was not prepared for and have not recovered from in any complete sense was his courtesy. I had prepared for questions I would have to deflect. I had prepared for suspicion I would have to outlast. I had not prepared for a man who accepted what I told him with the quiet dignity of someone who has learned, in years of searching, to receive disappointment without displaying it. That courtesy was the harder thing to carry home from the doorway than any accusation would have been. An accusation I could have set against my reasons and found them sufficient. His decency I could not set against anything. It simply stood there on my porch, as undeserved as everything else I had taken from him. And then it rode east down the valley road, and I've not been free of it since. Martin Voss went to his grave if he is dead, not knowing where his brother was. the real Caleb James Voss, the young man from Harrisburg who died at Shiloh at the age of 25, has a grave marker with his name on it in a Colorado churchyard, but his name belongs to a Virginia man buried under it, and his brother was sent away from the only accurate accounting of his death that existed on this earth, and that was my doing. Not August Dietrich's doing, mine. I don't tell this story because I have decided after 37 years to correct what I chose. I'm too old to correct it, and the correction would do more harm now than it would have done in 1878 when I burned the letters. James is not going to discover at 48 years of age that his name is not his name, and his land was claimed in the identity of a dead man. Ruth is not going to tell her children that their grandmother burned the evidence. Clara is not going to carry that to her grandchildren. I made a choice, and the choice compounded itself through the years in the way that choices do, and it is now sufficiently structural to the lives of the people I love that dismantling it would bring down more than the lie. But I am telling it now here because I believe that a reckoning of some kind is required of a person before they leave, even if the reckoning comes too late to be useful to anyone the person wronged. Martin Voss deserved the truth. The real Caleb James Voss deserved his name back, or at least deserved to have someone who knew the true accounting of where it went. I could not give them either of those things while I was living in a way that mattered. I'm giving them this now for whatever it is worth, which I reckon is not much, but is all I have left to offer. There's a grave in the Central City churchyard marked Caleb James Voss, beloved husband and father, 1836 to 1878. He was neither of those things, by the name on the stone. He was August Wilhelm Dietrich of Roanoke County, Virginia, who deserted a cause he could not sustain and built a different life under borrowed letters and lived it honestly enough in the daily sense that the people who knew him did not find reason to question it. I laid flowers on that grave every spring for 30 years. I still know the particular quality of the light on the mountains above Central City in September, which is when the aspens turn, and the air has the first edge of winter in it, and the peaks hold snow on their northern faces that will not melt until June. It was in that light that I buried my husband, and it is in that light, when I think of him, that I see him most clearly, the man I knew and the man I never knew, standing together in the same September afternoon, looking at the same mountains, carrying between them a weight that has now finally come to rest with me. I'm 73 years old. I will not be carrying it much longer. I've done what I could with what I was given, and I have not always done it rightly, and I am at a sufficient remove from the capacity for self-deception to acknowledge this without excessive embellishment in either direction. The secret buried with my husband was mine to keep or to tell, and I kept it, and I am telling it now, and neither the keeping nor the telling has felt entirely like justice. Perhaps that is the truest thing I know about it, that there was no version after October of 1878 in which justice was fully available. There was only the choice of which people would be served by what I did and which people would pay the cost of it. I made that choice. I have lived in it for 37 years. I expect I will not have to live in it much longer, and I find, now that the end of it is visible, that I am neither relieved nor regretful in the way I had supposed I would be. I am simply a woman of 73 who made the choices available to her and is now accounting for them as honestly as she is capable of, which may not be honest enough, but is the best she has. The mountains above Central City are still there. The aspen trees still turn in September. The grave is still marked with his borrowed name. And Martin Voss of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, if he is still living, still does not know what became of his brother. I put him on his horse and sent him down the valley road in June of 1883, and that is where I left him, and that is where, God help me, he will have to stay.